On to delivery, which is the area that I've probably got most experience in, having been thrown in the deep end quite a few times. Again, one of the reasons for the guide is that I wish I'd have had this book about 15 years ago, where when I didn't know quite what to do, I had to work it out. There was no guidance, and you could go and ask commercial, or you could ask someone in the team, or another project manager, and they'll all give you different answers, and perhaps they might not see them around for a while afterwards. It wasn't a great deal of help at the time. So here we are in nearly the final stage. Alistair's going to do the section on what you do when you've actually delivered, and that follows on through from actually delivering. You've got other tasks that need to be completed afterwards. So again, we've got the ability to look before and after. So when you get to this stage, I found that I'm often in the case where very little has been done formally beforehand, or if it has been done, it's not thorough enough. So you're ending up here. The guide will give you a reflection on what you would have liked to have seen happen, and if you didn't quite know what should have happened, then it can actually tell you that. And quite quickly as well, because you can just thumb through to the section that you think you want to go to. And then afterwards, you've got some factors here, the closure and handover, and the ongoing operation support. And one thing about that is you need to think about that far earlier than at the end of the process. I'm sure Alistair will tell you that. So, what is your role is what we're going to be looking at. When you, again, make an assessment, you need to understand what is needed, what the process is. In my humble estimation, there's lots of different ways you could do things. I've got a way that I kind of approach it, and I think it's quite a modern way, and we put that into the guide. How to use the guide itself, and then what people tend to want to know is what the pitfalls are. Can be. So when you're project manager, you are basically the one that everyone comes to for solutions, and you need to be able to manage that. So we've got your suppliers, which we're talking about quite a lot on today. We've got various other controls that have to go on in your project management methods. You've got other stakeholders, internal, other function managers, general management, areas where they're impacted, maybe resourcing. Usually there's all sorts of politics where somebody's made a decision and they want to protect themselves, etc., etc. Customers, so your ultimate client may have other stakeholders outside of their organisation, particularly if you're in government, then there's usually stakeholders all over the place that want to know about what's going on, but generally want the project manager to tell them, so in a way that they can understand. You might even have kind of union action in certain circumstances. So if you're in the middle here, that's a lot to do on your day job. If you get any of these wrong, you can quite quickly become in a quite difficult situation to manage. So what we're concentrating on is at least one of these is one that perhaps there isn't that much written about, is how you manage when you're procuring inputs. Next. So we went through this earlier, but when does your role as a PM end? These days things are moving into far more benefit management, benefit realisation, and it may not be that you know the end result of your project so to some time after the work of completing that, in the word completing the functional work has been done. So sometimes you may have to be involved very much after the event of the completion of the project. So, and again. So we're looking now, whereas traditionally you were managing a change as a project manager, you're not only managing the change and then finishing, we're actually looking at the outcomes, which is, I think, the way the industry is going generally. So here we are, one of the things I mentioned earlier about the contract, sometimes they're quite lengthy documents, sometimes they've got lots of references to other documents, but it's absolutely imperative that you get a copy of all of the contract documents and that you review them, because that's what you'll be held to if there is an issue. And in fact, sometimes there may be things in there that you would like to have seen, but are not there. So that's a risk that you need to have in your risk register. You need to start looking at that as soon as you start the job. So on this is probably not very readable, but as you can see, there's lots of stuff there that you need to check through, and perhaps in the guide you could use that as a basic checklist of the sorts of things that you find in your contract and you don't find. And that's imperative that you do that review and ask questions so that you know where the holes are. That it may be that it's too loose a contract, in which case you need to get far more closer, and that it's a matter of juggling all the things you have to do on a day-to-day basis. And the procurement exercise might be reasonably okay, in which case you've got a lot of other factors to look at, or it might be the main thing that you need to be on top of.
What I'll just say about that one is that when I do days training, that's often the most popular slide, right? Because people go, right, I can review a contract and see A, see if it's got stuff in there, and B, as the project manager, I can use it as a checklist to say, don't necessarily need to, or be able to recite the contract word for word, but do I know what the position is on this? Yeah? Because if I can answer questions on all of that, then I know the contract, yeah? And then I can answer questions in accordance with it, etc., etc.
Yeah. And you might have to make provisions yourself for the fact that if it's not detailed in the way that you'd like to see it in the contract, then you have to put a methodology into how you manage it so that you're taking that into account and you effectively avoid the issue that could occur because the contract was not what you were hoping it would be. So it's slightly out of focus there. Sorry about that, it doesn't seem to be coming over too well on the slide. But this is the process of managing once you're under contract and you're doing the day-to-day project management of that contract and with the procured providers in there. So clearly you've got inputs, which are all these acceptance of the contract document itself, whatever that format may take, the various technical requirements which will be referred from the contract at that time, some of which will be being developed during the process of the contract, but the ones that you start with need to be clearly available as inputs. And there are a number of other types of document that would need to be looked at. For example, non-disclosure agreements, the schedule that was envisaged at the time of the generation of the contract, any assumptions, any risks that have been taken into account internally, the risk registers that have been supplied by the providers, in fact all the documentation that they provided at the beginning. So with that, you then should be able to get to a point where you understand what's available. If there's something missing, then you may need to take action. So one of my favourite processes is the PDCA, which is Plan, Do, Check, Act. And that's the way, when I look back, how I've basically managed this kind of project, where there are outsourced providers, because it's something that's constant through the project. one of the dangers is you can leave the providers to go off and say, well, they're under contract, that's what they're going to provide, we'll come back to them, let them get on with it, they know what they're doing. That tends not to work. You really do need to make sure you understand what they're doing, and that, in my understanding, means that you have to have a cyclic approach, which means that you go through a number of cycles throughout the project. The frequency of those cycles is also dependent on how near things are to what you want them to be. So I would suggest you need to start at a relatively high frequency of checking. In this case, things could be where certain elements are designed, then they're built, then they're delivered, then they might be integrated to a certain degree and they're accepted, and then there may be other things that come through that have to go through that process throughout the project. But in all of that cycle, there will be individual cycles that you follow to check where you are at that point in time, which is why I always just think it's a good idea to put a schedule of meetings in and schedule of reviews, so that you know at a point in time that people know you're going to be checking where they are, and not just leaving it till some point in time, like, oh, things don't seem to be going quite right, I better go and have a look. You need to have, I think it's better to do that in a proactive way, and also that needs to be told to the team, the wider team, at the beginning, at the initiation, as to how you intend to manage them, so that they're aware that they're not just going to be allowed to go away and do what they think they should be doing. You're going to be on top of it. And even if you don't actually go into a great deal of detail, just give them the idea that you actually are on the ball and you're going to do that. It's pretty important. So what happens is there's the initiation process. There's usually, even though there are plans probably in the contract or referred to, there'll be an element of additional planning once you're under contract, details, tasks, who's doing what. Then you go through the implementation cycle, and there'll be however many cycles there are of different stages and different aspects. Final acceptance, and then you decide whether you're going to close the contract or not, and obviously you go on to the handover and support. In tandem with all that is your risk management, which is clearly something we do as project managers all the time, and that means that you actually have a cycle of risk management. You assess the risks on the same cycle as your general management meetings, and you have a risk register, so you can't read that says risk register. And that's a cycle that everyone should be involved with. And then change management. Things will develop, changes occur in specifications. Doesn't necessarily mean there'll be a change to price or cost, but it needs to be managed. Anyone can introduce a change or request a change, and that needs to be reviewed by means of the change management process, which is you have your change register, you review and assign so the assignability of who that change is going to be originating from, decide on the liability, whether it's worth doing the change or not, or who's liable for it, in which case there is a change to the contract. And then if there is a change and it requires a change to contract, then we need to assess whether it's acceptable what's being proposed back from the providers. So those things are running in sort of in tandem with the main management process for the project and for the contract. And at the end of the process, we'll have outputs which should be an implemented, delivered and integrated project package, the various stages of documentation, go-live information that's needed, a schedule of obligations that extend beyond the end of the formal project part of the contract, and then a description of follow-on operations and maintenance support contracts. So that's kind of my way of thinking of how you work on a day-to-day basis. This cycle of checking to see whether people have got to where you expect them to have, and then looking at any issues. That can be done by means of teleconferences. Doesn't necessarily mean if you've got people overseas, it doesn't necessarily have to be in the same room, but still need to make sure that that work goes on. So initiating, this is an important area where you're defining now how everything's going to be operated under your project management. So it's important that people understand that you are interested in this, and this is how we intend to run it. I often have in the contract as an annex a statement of work which would tell them this at the outset, so that there's actually a procedure, a process of how we manage our contracts, and that should interface with their internal procedures. And one of the factors of whether you accept a provider's proposal is whether their processes are up to being managed in this way, because they'll need to provide enough resource to be able to run this in parallel. It's not just they do the job, they need to be able to report on it as well, and that takes time. So you do the contract review, which is an internal employer, i.e. the one who's presenting the contract to the provider. Do your own review when you start off, so make sure that's like knowing the contract, making sure that the team internally also knows what the main pertinent factors are, who the stakeholders are, so that's kind of inaugural work. Identify key roles and responsibilities of all the key people in your team, and who's going to manage the contract, whether it's yourself or someone else. As I say, schedule meetings, set the agendas. There's sort of a template for agendas you can have. It means that you don't miss anything when you run meetings. And then prioritising an inaugural meeting. You might have more than one, because you might want to, one of the providers that you have might have specific requirements that you need to look at first before you go out to the rest. But all of the providers need to have an inaugural meeting where you make clear all of these facts, and also that you get feedback. So, you know, is there a problem with that, or have you got enough resources? Trying to get to know them as well, ideally. If you've been involved with the tendering stage, then that helps an awful lot, because you probably had eye-to-eye contact. But quite often it doesn't happen because of people's time. Formalised communications, that's a really important one. There can be all sorts of wrong communications where people think they need to send an email A to B to C, and then, oh, that's not exactly where it was controlled, and maybe some information got to the wrong place at the wrong time, maybe someone was misunderstood. So you need to make sure you tell people what you're expecting in communications, and the fact that we are not changing the contract in an email. We will only be changing the contract. Everything is subject to contract. Make sure that your team aren't behind the scenes discussing things that end up being, oh, well, I was just told that was, going to happen, and it hasn't happened. Well, no, it's not in the contract. Oh, yeah, but I was told, and it's in the minutes of this meeting. Oh, right. So be careful about that one. Make sure the communication channels are known. Ideally, you would have someone, particularly in a larger project or a larger procurement, you'd have someone acting as a communications controller that would actually, make sure that all the information was archived. That could be the project manager. It could be that you have a subcontract manager that works for you that would help doing that, or an administrator, just to make sure that information is not lost. Another one, when you're working with disparate providers, you can't expect them to do everything the way that you do it. I mean, obviously you want to have various meetings, but if they've got an enterprise system which is for manufacturing, they're not going to change that for you. So you need to be able to say, well, actually, what are we going to use? We're going to use your system, we're going to change. So initiate the contract and then improving operation of it is the PDCA. So there's such a thing as contract administration and contract management. And John, this is one of your things.
My little pet themes is that there is, in terms of if you have a look at how you interpret a contract and the rules of interpretation legally, it's not extreme interpretations because it suits you, yeah? There's a whole load of rules, but in broadness, we high level headline them as you have to be fair, reasonable in the interpretation, yeah? And there are certain actions within a contract where you actually have to be an impartial administrator. So those are the things like payment, acceptance of deliverables, etc. You can't say, well, I know I didn't absolutely specify the gold standard, but I could just about read that to mean I wanted the gold standard, and you haven't met my just about readable standard of gold standard, therefore I'm not accepting it, yeah? Not on a fair reading. So on those things, payment, have you completed that to the stage set? Yes, you're entitled to it. Acceptance of deliverables, assessment of change in terms of the quantification of it. Other residual matters, and I'm quoting a judge there from one judgment on a form of contract which we're quite familiar with, so, in terms of being impartial administrator. Yeah? So not taking an extreme view. And some contracts, effectively, that's all they allow you to be, is an impartial administrator. But we are the Association for Project Management. If all you're an impartial administrator can do is an impartial administrator, you're a contract administrator. Yeah. Other contracts, and this goes back to the consistent theme, is how you set it up, is actually allow you to project manage, and there you can make the best decisions in the interests of the client. Yeah. So, for example, you want to change. You go out in accordance with the contract and get a quotation back, and the contract contains certain criteria by how you evaluate change, which are high level, fair and reasonable, but more defined. As an administrator, you're saying, based on those criteria, has the contractor evaluated that change properly? Yeah. Now, putting my contract management hat on, representing the best interests of the employer, the client. Actually, is that, do I want that, yeah? Do I want that? With that bells and whistles. Yeah? Yes, it fits in with their objectives. It will add sufficient value to justify the price that I'm paying for it. Or actually, no, I didn't realise that it was on the critical path, therefore I'm not just paying for the direct cost of getting it, I'm paying for the whole delay and disruption, etc., and it'll delay the whole project. No, actually, no. Best interest of the client, don't have it. Yeah? So be clear where you are in the contract on whether you're impartially administrating it, because if you then do extreme interpretation and gets to the courts or anywhere near there, you're in trouble, yeah, or whether you're managing it. Okay?
So we have a process for outlining the necessary review aspects during delivery, input and output requirements, a look back and look ahead, reminders of what to check during the PDCA cycle, and status reporting, what to cover when contracting the packages. What can go wrong? Well, quite a bit if you get things wrong. And it's more a case of pre-armed understanding where things you think might well go wrong. What can I do to avoid that? And that usually means gathering information about what the situation is as early as possible. And it also means having a proper risk register, which isn't just, lip service to, oh, I've got a risk register. The risk register is a tool for managing risk. Managing risk is the important thing. What is actually happening? Are people actually looking at this? Don't leave it to them, whoever they are, to plan for significant. You need to plan for your own engagement with the wider team, or delegate someone else to make sure we get the information. Looking at stakeholder management, another very good aspect. It's all part of it. Your suppliers and providers are stakeholders. So PDCA, I've already talked about that. And obviously, there are additional risks of procurement. Don't make change a no-no, because an early change that might cost a few thousand might save something that costs many thousand later on. Don't be afraid to ask the difficult questions. Now, this could help because sometimes people avoid the difficult questions because people think, well, you're just being nasty, why are you asking that? I wouldn't dream of doing that. But in the guide, we've actually got a set of difficult questions. So you can refer to the guide and say, well, in the guide, it says you could be doing this, you could poaching our personnel, you could have fraud change control. What are you doing about support? Have we got some conflicts in the way that work is divided? What about award of contract slippage? What can happen is you might draft your contract in January. The actual date of signing might be March, April, but if you've got actual dates in the contract, then you're stuck because you've just lost several months. So making sure that when T0 is when everything started, and when you've got more than one provider, that T0 can be misunderstood throughout the whole enterprise. The other thing is reviews. So, sorry, it's mainly a diagram. So when you've got something that is provided by, let's say, provider B, provider A needs to also review it. You then have a technical lead that needs to review it, and then it needs to come up and is either accepted or not. That can take a considerable time. So the dates that people put in plans may be when they get it, but it's not when you necessarily have it finished. Okay. So there's in Appendix A of the Contracts and Procurement Guide is a set of what we call them typical risks associated with external contracting. So they're actually quite useful to check on. So here as a basic list, in some of our events we have workshops where we ask people what they find in practice, what goes wrong for you. And I've got a league table of the sorts of things that go wrong. Interestingly, one of the main things which you wouldn't necessarily guess, not there, but it's where you've got dependency linkage, i.e. the employer as provider A and provider B, you know what the dependencies are in that direction, you know what the dependencies are in that direction. Do you know what the dependencies are in that direction? And is there another provider that's involved, in which case they're dependent on them, but you didn't know they were dependent on them, in which case there's a dependency that you haven't documented. And mostly it's the things that go wrong is because there are dependencies that just haven't been explored, and they come up in the middle of the project, and then the provider says, well, I was dependent on supplier B. Anyway, so there's a list of those various things that can go wrong, so what you do if you're managing and you understand what can go wrong, you've always got this in the back of your mind, and you're thinking, well, does that mean that's going wrong? Does that mean that's going wrong? And you sort of have to keep on the ball in terms of looking at these things to determine whether something's going wrong. So there's Appendix A. That's just something you can't read it, but it comes into this. You've got the risk description, possible containment and preventive measures that you can take for each one. Outputs, contract documents at the end, any agreed modifications or addition to them, final project schedule, you can see what's happened, risk register identifies any ongoing risks, archive meeting minutes and archive records for the future. Okay. Go live information, ongoing operational information, any obligations that go beyond the project finish, what you think is the finish. Follow and maintenance operation support contracts. So how to use the guide during delivery. And again, going back to that, just where you are in this process, where you are overall, if you're in the management stage, you can then go to that part of the guide and look at what's needed there and look back and forward and decide whether you need to take any action. So I think what we've covered is your role of delivery of contracted packages, making the assessment when you start, what the process is, how to use the guide, and some of the most common pitfalls, which I could go on endlessly about.
And very useful, very useful.
Next.
Right.
And question, 1 minute. Can we spare a minute?
We can spare a minute. Any amplifications or clarification questions? As in, can you say a bit more, or I didn't quite understand? Okay. All right. Other questions for John? No? Going. John, right. And now on to. So thanks very much, John.
Okay.